The ship was dying, and everyone on board knew it. Captain Vietha Soren stood on the bridge of the Shallenveer and watched the warning lights flash red across every screen in front of her. Hull breaches on 12 decks, engines barely holding together, life support running on the last reserves they had left, and 4,200 Rithani souls packed into every corridor and cargo hold behind her. Men, women, children, all of them running from the same nightmare. The Draelcor had come for their world 6 months ago, and they had not come to conquer or to enslave. They had come to erase, and that was exactly what they did. Billions dead in a matter of weeks, cities turned to glass, oceans boiled away, and the few who escaped did so on whatever ships they could find. The Shallenveer was never meant for war, or even for long journeys. It was a merchant carrier, built to haul cargo between friendly ports, and now it carried the last survivors of an entire civilization across a galaxy that did not care if they lived or died. Vietha gripped the console with all 4 of her hands and stared at the star chart. The nearest safe port was 60 light-years away, and the ship would never make it. Not with the engines failing, not with the hull cracking open like an egg, not with half the power grid already gone dark. But there was one option. A tiny blue planet orbiting an average star on the far edge of the galaxy, listed in the old charts as Sol-free. The record said it was inhabited by a pre-FTL species, primitive, uncontacted, probably still throwing rocks at each other in the dirt. Galactical law strictly forbade landing on such a world, but galactic law would not keep her people alive tonight. Set course for Sol-3, Vietha said quietly. Her first officer looked at her with wide silver eyes and asked if she was serious. We land or we die, she answered, and that was the end of the discussion. The Shallenveer dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a dying spiral above the blue planet. The ship shook and groaned as it fell through the atmosphere, fire licking across the damaged hull, and Vietha held on and prayed to whatever gods might still be listening. They crashed in a desert, a wide, flat, empty stretch of sand and rock under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. The impact threw everyone forward, and the lights went out for 3 terrible seconds before the emergency power kicked in and bathed everything in dull red light. Vietha pulled herself up and looked around the bridge. No one was dead, at least not here, and she could hear the cries of children echoing from the lower decks, scared but alive. She opened the main hatch and stepped outside into the cool night air of an alien world. The desert was silent for exactly 90 seconds. Then the sky filled with noise, a deep thundering roar that shook the ground, and Vietha looked up to see strange metal crafts screaming overhead, fast and loud and angry. They circled the crash site like predators, and within minutes the ground around the ship was bathed in blinding white light from above. Vehicles appeared on the horizon, dozens of them, armored and fast, kicking up clouds of dust as they surrounded the Shallenveer. Vietha could see figures emerging, 2-armed, 2-legged creatures in dark clothing, carrying weapons she did not recognize, moving with a discipline and coordination that surprised her. She had expected primitives. These did not look primitive at all. One vehicle stopped closer than the rest, and a single figure stepped out, tall for a human, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and calm, steady eyes that did not blink even once as he looked at Vietha, and her 4 arms, and her silver-blue skin. He wore a uniform covered in small symbols and patches, and he spoke into a device on his shoulder before walking forward with his hands open and empty at his sides. "I am Colonel Marcus Cole, United States Air Force," he said in a voice that was firm but not threatening, and somehow the ship's damaged translation systems caught enough of it to make sense. Vietha stared at him and did not know what to say. She had prepared herself for hostility, for fear, for weapons pointed at her face, not for a calm man with open hands. "We mean no harm," she managed to say through the translator, her voice shaking more than she wanted it to. "Our ship is damaged, and our people are hurt, and we had nowhere else to go." Cole looked past her, at the massive broken ship, at the smoke rising from the hull, at the faces of frightened Rithani civilians pressing against the observation windows. And she saw something shift in his expression, something she had not expected to see on the face of a stranger on an alien world. It was not fear, and it was not anger. It was concern. He spoke into his radio again, and Vietha heard him say words she would never forget. "Tell Washington we have guests, and they look like they need a hospital." Within the hour, the desert was transformed. More vehicles arrived, along with strange wheeled structures that unfolded into shelters, and humans in white clothing began setting up what Vietha slowly realized was a medical station, right there in the sand, under the open sky, for people they had never seen before. The Rithani civilians were guided out of the ship carefully, gently, by humans who could not speak their language, but who smiled and gestured, and offered water and blankets with a kindness that made no strategic sense. Vietha watched all of it from the base of the ship's ramp, and tried to understand what was happening. On every other world she had visited, strangers were threats. You kept your distance. You negotiated from strength. You never showed weakness, because weakness was an invitation to be destroyed. But these humans saw weakness and ran toward it. A small Rithani girl, no older than 6 cycles, stumbled down the ramp and collapsed onto the sand. She had not had water in 2 days, and her body simply gave out. Before Vietha could move, a human was already there. A young woman with red hair and tired eyes, who dropped to her knees beside the child without a single moment of hesitation. She did not know what species this little girl was, did not know if touching her was safe, did not know anything at all about the creature lying in the dirt in front of her. And none of that mattered. She checked the child's breathing, called for help, cradled the small blue head in her hands, and whispered soft words that the translator could not catch, but that needed no translation at all. Vietha felt something crack inside her chest. Not pain, but something older and deeper. Something she had been holding together with nothing but willpower since the day her world burned. Colonel Cole appeared beside her and watched the scene with quiet eyes. "Your people are safe here," he said simply. Vietha looked at him, and for the first time in 6 months, she believed that someone was telling her the truth. She did not know yet what these humans were capable of. She did not know about their wars, their weapons, their terrible and beautiful history of violence, and invention and stubborn refusal to stay down when the universe knocked them flat. She did not know that she had just landed on the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. All she knew, standing in that desert under those strange stars, was that her people were being carried to safety by creatures who had every reason to be afraid, and chose not to be. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks passed, and Vietha still could not believe what she was seeing. The crash site in the Nevada desert had been transformed into something the humans called a cooperation zone, a sprawling compound of tents and temporary buildings and heavy machinery that seemed to grow larger every single day. Trucks arrived at all hours, carrying equipment and supplies. Helicopters circled overhead like metal birds, and people poured in from every corner of the planet. Not just soldiers, scientists, engineers, doctors, translators, cooks, and ordinary people who had simply shown up because they wanted to help. Vietha had lived her entire life among the stars, and she had never seen anything like it. The United Nations, which she learned was a gathering of all the human nations, a concept that amazed her because the Rithani had been one nation for 10,000 years, held emergency meetings, and agreed to provide full assistance to the alien refugees. Food and clean water arrived by the truckload. Medical teams set up a proper field hospital, and human doctors, who had never treated anything other than their own species, began learning Rithani biology with a speed that was almost frightening. Dr. Lena Okafor arrived on the third day. She was a tall woman with dark brown skin and sharp, clever eyes, an aerospace engineer from a place called London, who had been pulled from a research project and flown to Nevada on a military transport. She led a team of 60 human engineers and scientists, all of them chosen because they were the best at what they did, and their job was to assess the damage to the Shalanvir and figure out how to fix it. Vietha expected them to be confused by the alien technology. The Rithani had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, while these humans had barely made it to their own moon. But what happened instead shook her understanding of this species to its core. Lena's team did not stare at the Rithani technology in wonder. They stared at it in recognition. "This is a harmonic resonance drive," Lena said on her first day inside the engine room, running her hands over the crystal arrays with an expression that was half amazement and half frustration. "We theorized this. We actually theorized this 20 years ago, but we could never get the power scaling right." Within 4 days, her team had not only understood the FTL drive, but had found the flaw in its calibration that had been causing power loss for years, a flaw that Rithani engineers had accepted as normal, and fixed it. The drive now ran 18% more efficiently than it ever had, even when the ship was brand new. Vietha stood in the engine room and watched a human woman casually improve technology that was older than human civilization. And she felt something she could not name. Something between admiration and a strange cold fear. The Shalanvir had been built with a lightweight Rithani alloy that was elegant and efficient, but had never been designed to take serious punishment. Lena's metallurgist studied it for 2 days, and then proposed something the Rithani had never considered: layering it with human materials, a composite blend of tungsten carbide and titanium pressed into the alien alloy in alternating sheets. "Why would you layer different metals together like that?" asked Vietha's chief engineer, genuinely puzzled. A young human metallurgist grinned and said, "Because we spent centuries trying to stop things from punching holes in our tanks, and this is what we figured out." The new hull plating was tested with a controlled explosion in the desert. The Rithani engineers flinched at the blast. The humans cheered. When the smoke cleared, the plating was barely scratched, and it was 3 times stronger than anything the Shalanvir had carried before. The humans did not just repair what was broken. They looked at every system and asked the same question over and over. What if we made this better? The life support systems were redesigned to be more efficient. The navigation computers were upgraded with human processing algorithms that somehow made them faster. Even the doors were fixed so they opened and closed more smoothly, because one human engineer said it bothered him that they stuck. But it was not all engineering and science. There were quiet moments too, moments that mattered more than any of the technical achievements. Vietha watched a human chef argue passionately with a Rithani nutritionist about the correct way to prepare food for alien biology. She watched human children who had come with their military parents play with Rithani children in the dust outside the compound, communicating through laughter and gestures, because laughter, it turned out, was universal. She watched a human soldier sit beside an elderly Rithani woman who could not stop trembling and hold her hand in silence for an hour, because he could see that she was afraid, and he did not need to speak her language to offer comfort. These humans were strange and wonderful, and Vietha did not fully understand them, but she was beginning to. It was on the 15th day that Colonel Cole came to find her. He had been patient, more patient than she expected from a military officer, and he had waited until her people were fed and sheltered and safe before asking the question she knew was coming. He found her standing on a ridge overlooking the compound at sunset, the sky burning orange and red, in a way that reminded her painfully of home. "Captain," he said, standing beside her with his hands clasped behind his back. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Vietha nodded. "What are you running from?" She was quiet for a long time, watching the sun sink below the horizon. And then she told him everything. She told him about the Draelcore Dominion, an empire that had existed for 12,000 years, ruled by a species that believed the galaxy belonged to them and them alone. She told him how they moved from system to system, not conquering but exterminating, wiping out entire civilizations with a cold efficiency that had no anger behind it and no mercy in it. She told him about the day they came to her world, and how the sky turned black with their ships, and how the oceans boiled, and the cities crumbled, and billions of voices went silent in a single, terrible week. She told him about the refugee fleet that scattered in every direction, about the ships that were hunted down one by one, about how the Shalenveer was the last one she knew of that was still flying. Cole listened without interrupting. His face did not change, his breathing did not quicken, and his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if he were watching something far away that only he could see. When she finished, the desert was dark, and the stars were coming out, alien stars in an alien sky, and the silence between them was heavy with the weight of everything she had said. Then Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out a small communication device. He pressed a button and spoke 4 words into it. "Get me the Pentagon." The conversation that followed lasted 3 minutes. Vietha could not hear the other side, but she watched Cole's face and saw something settle into it. A decision, firm and final, like a door closing. He put the device away and turned to face her. "Captain," he said, and his voice was different now. Not softer, not harder, but deeper somehow, as if he were speaking from a place inside himself that he did not visit often. "How would you feel about a few upgrades?" Vietha frowned and asked what he meant. Cole looked back at the compound, where the Shalenveer sat under floodlights, surrounded by scaffolding and cranes, and hundreds of humans working through the night, and he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a cruel smile, but the smile of a man who had just given himself permission to do something he was very, very good at. "You came here for a patch job," he said. "We would like to offer you the full package." Vietha did not understand, not yet, but she would, and when she did, she would realize that the moment Colonel Marcus Cole made that phone call was the moment everything changed, not just for her people, and not just for Earth, but for the entire galaxy. Because humanity had just learned that there were monsters among the stars. And if there was one thing humans understood better than kindness, it was how to fight monsters. 3 months after the crash landing, the desert compound had a new name, Zone Prometheus, and it had become the most important place on Earth. What had started as a makeshift camp around a broken alien ship was now a full military-industrial facility, stretching across miles of Nevada sand. Governments from every continent had sent their best people and their best equipment, and the whole world was watching with a mix of excitement and fear as humanity undertook its first real project as a united species. They were not just repairing the Shalenveer anymore. They were rebuilding it from the inside out, and they were rebuilding it for war. Dr. Lena Okafor stood in the main engineering bay, with grease on her face and fire in her eyes, directing teams of human and Rathani engineers who worked side by side 20 hours a day. She had not slept properly in weeks, and she did not care, because what they were building was unlike anything that had ever existed, a fusion of alien elegance and human brutality that made her heart race every time she looked at the blueprints. The weapons came first. The Shalenveer had carried low-yield plasma emitters, polite little guns designed for deterrence, the kind of weapons a merchant ship mounted to look tough without actually being tough. Lena's weapons team ripped them out on the first day and replaced them with something very different. Human weapons engineers from 6 different countries worked together to design a new arsenal. They installed kinetic mass drivers, essentially giant railguns that fired tungsten slugs at a fraction of the speed of light along the ship's spine. They mounted missile pods adapted from naval destroyer systems along both flanks, loaded with warheads that carried autonomous targeting systems smart enough to chase a target through an asteroid field. And then they created something entirely new, a hybrid weapon that wrapped superheated plasma around a tungsten penetrator rod, combining the punch of a bullet with the burn of a star. When they tested the hybrid weapon on an armored target plate in the desert, the plate did not just break, it ceased to exist. The Rithani weapons officer watched the test from a safe distance and said nothing for a very long time. The shields came next. The original Rithani energy shields were designed to deflect space dust and small debris. They were never meant to stop weapons fire. Human electrical engineers studied them for a week and then redesigned them from scratch, using principles borrowed from electromagnetic pulse research and something called reactive impedance layering that nobody but the humans seemed to fully understand. The new shields could absorb incoming energy, redistribute it across the grid, and in some cases, actually reflect it back at the attacker. When a Rithani scientist asked how the humans had come up with this idea, a young American engineer shrugged and said, "We spent 50 years figuring out how to protect ourselves from our own nuclear weapons. This is basically the same thing, but in space." The hull armor was reinforced again, this time with a layer of reactive plating that human tank designers had perfected over decades of ground warfare. If something hit the hull hard enough to crack the outer layer, the reactive layer would explode outward to neutralize the impact before it could reach the inner shell. The ship would essentially fight back against anything that touched it. Communications were overhauled completely. Human cyber warfare specialists installed encrypted quantum communication arrays that were theoretically impossible to intercept, alongside electronic warfare suites that could jam enemy signals, spoof false communications, and even hijack the targeting systems of hostile ships and turn their own weapons against them. But it was the small human touches that truly baffled the Rithani. Someone installed cup holders on the bridge, sturdy ones that could hold a drink steady even during combat maneuvers. A Swedish furniture company sent ergonomic chairs designed specifically for Rithani four-armed bodies, after their engineers saw news footage and could not stand the thought of people sitting in uncomfortable seats. A team of Italian and Japanese chefs arrived at Zone Prometheus and installed a fully functional kitchen in what had been a storage bay, because Colonel Cole had made a phone call and said, "You cannot fight a war on bad food," and apparently that was all the justification anyone needed. A human music teacher set up speakers in the crew quarters and programmed them to play soft ambient sounds, rain falling, wind through trees, ocean waves, because she had read that the Rithani were sensitive to silence and thought it might help them sleep. These small acts of thoughtfulness, woven between the weapons and armor and war machines, told Vietha something important about this species. They were not building a killing machine. They were building a home that could kill, and they saw no contradiction in that. Meanwhile, in a cleared area of desert behind the main compound, Sergeant Amir Reyes was doing something no one in the galaxy had ever attempted before. He was teaching aliens how to fight like humans. Reyes was a Marine combat instructor, compact and quiet, with dark eyes that miss nothing. And he had been given 300 Rithani volunteers and told to turn them into soldiers. The Rithani were physically capable, strong and fast with excellent reflexes. But they had no warrior tradition. Their civilization had achieved peace thousands of years ago and had simply never developed the art of organized violence. Reyes changed that in 12 weeks. He taught them room-clearing techniques and fire and maneuver drills. He taught them how to set ambushes and how to escape them. He taught them hand-to-hand combat, adapted for four-armed fighters, which turned out to be devastatingly effective once the Rithani stopped apologizing for hitting too hard. He taught them the concept of fighting dirty, attacking from unexpected angles, using deception, exploiting every advantage, no matter how small or how unfair. There is no such thing as a fair fight, Reyes told them on the first day. There are only fights you win and fights you lose, and we are going to make sure you win. The Rithani were horrified at first. Their culture valued harmony and balance, and the idea of deliberately causing pain went against everything they believed. But Reyes was patient, and he was honest. And slowly they began to understand that fighting was not about cruelty. It was about survival, about protecting the people behind you, about making sure the ones who burned your world would never burn another. By the end of the third month, the Rithani volunteers moved like a different species. They were sharp and coordinated and fierce, and there was something in their eyes that had not been there before. Not anger, not hatred, but a cold, steady resolve that Reyes recognized because he had seen it in the mirror every morning of his adult life. Vietha watched all of this unfold and struggled with it every day. She was a merchant captain, a woman who had spent her life trading goods between peaceful ports, and now she was standing at the center of a war machine, being built around her by a species she had known for 3 months. One evening, she sat alone on the hull of her ship, her changed, armored, weaponized ship, and stared at the stars and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. Lena found her there. The engineer climbed up and sat beside her without saying anything for a while, and they watched the human workers below moving through pools of floodlight like small determined ants. "I did not ask for any of this," Vietha said quietly. "I know," Lena replied. "I am not a warrior. I do not know how to lead people into battle. I am afraid that I will fail, and that everything your people have built will be wasted." Lena was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that Vietha would carry with her for the rest of her life. "You do not have to want war, Vietha. You just have to want your people to survive. We will handle the rest." 3 days later, the ship was ready. The Rithani crew and their human advisors gathered on the bridge for the final systems check. Every screen glowed green, every weapon was loaded, every shield was charged, and the new hybrid FTL drive hummed with a power it had never known before. The Shalenveer had a new name now. The crew had voted on it together, Rithani and human alike. They called it the Shalenvrin, which in the old Rithani tongue meant the star that stopped weeping. And on the hull, beneath the flowing alien script, someone had painted 6 words in bold black human letters that could be read from a mile away. "Return to sender." The ship lifted off from Zone Prometheus at dawn, rising on rebuilt engines that roared with a voice the desert had never heard before. It climbed through the atmosphere, surrounded by an escort of human fighter jets flying in perfect formation, their pilots saluting a ship they had helped build with their own hands. Vietha stood on the bridge and watched Earth shrink behind her. That small blue world, full of strange, kind, terrifying people. And she heard Colonel Cole's voice come through the communication system one last time. "Give them hell, Captain, and if you need us again, you know where we live." Vietha closed her eyes and felt the ship surge forward into the dark between the stars. She was still afraid. But, for the first time since her world had died, she was not afraid of what was coming. She was afraid of what she was about to become. And somewhere deep in the ship, in the kitchen that should not have existed on a warship, a pot of coffee was brewing, because the humans had insisted on it. And the humans were right. You really could not fight a war on bad food. The Korvan system was burning. Warlord Kreth Domovon stood on the command deck of the Draelkor flagship, Teeth of Night, and watched his extermination fleet work with the calm satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his own art. 14 warships arranged in a perfect siege formation around the third planet, their guns methodically reducing the surface to slag, while the refugee ships huddled in orbit like frightened animals waiting to be slaughtered. There were 6 different species down there, remnants and runaways from worlds the Dominion had already erased, and they had gathered here, thinking they would be safe in the far reaches of unclaimed space. They had been wrong, because there was no place in the galaxy where the Drael'Kor could not reach, and there was no species the Drael'Kor considered worthy of continued existence. Kreth was tall, even by Drael'Kor standards, his gray-armored skin scarred from 100 campaigns, his 4 red eyes burning with the cold fire of absolute certainty. He had served the Dominion for 300 years, and he had never once questioned the mission. Lesser species existed to be removed, and he was the instrument of that removal. Kreth was tall, even by Drael'Kor standards, his gray-armored skin scarred from 100 campaigns. Kreth glanced at the sensor data and felt nothing. It was a Rythani vessel, a refugee carrier by its configuration, probably another straggler from the extermination of the Rythani homeworld. He had destroyed dozens of these ships, and they were all the same, slow, unarmed, fragile, full of terrified civilians who broadcast desperate pleas for mercy right up until the moment they became debris. "Send a single destroyer to deal with it," Kreth ordered without interest, and turned back to watch the bombardment. The destroyer Iron Purpose broke formation and moved to intercept the newcomer. Its captain was experienced and efficient, and expected the engagement to last less than 2 minutes, a standard kill on a standard target. The Iron Purpose fired its forward plasma batteries at optimal range, 4 concentrated bursts that should have torn through the Rythani ship like claws through wet paper. The shots hit something and scattered. The destroyer captain stared at his screen and did not understand what he was seeing. The plasma bolts had struck the target and simply broken apart, dispersing across some kind of energy barrier that had absorbed the impact without even flickering. He fired again, a full broadside this time, every weapon on the ship, and watched the energy wash over the Rythani vessel like water over stone. Then the Rythani ship turned toward him, and the destroyer captain noticed something he had missed in his initial scan. The ship's hull was wrong. It was too thick, too layered, covered in angular plating that did not match any Rythani design he had ever seen, and there were weapon mouths along its spine and flanks that had definitely not been there in any intelligence file. A communication channel opened from the Rythani ship, and a female voice spoke in clear, deliberate tones that the translator rendered without emotion. "You have 1 chance to withdraw. There will not be a second." The destroyer captain reported the situation to Kreth, who felt the first small spark of curiosity he had experienced in decades. A Rythani ship that could absorb weapons fire and had the audacity to issue a warning. This was unusual enough to be interesting. "All Vanguard ships, engage and destroy," Kreth ordered, committing 4 warships to what he still considered a minor distraction. The 4 Drael'Kor warships moved into attack formation with the practiced precision of an empire that had been waging war for 12,000 years. They were fast and powerful and crewed by soldiers who had never known defeat, and they opened fire with everything they had. What happened next would be studied and debated across the galaxy for centuries. The Shalanvrin did not run, and it did not hide. It accelerated directly into the Drael'Kor formation at a speed that should have been impossible for a ship its size, and it began firing weapons that the Drael'Kor had never encountered before. The first kinetic rounds, tungsten slugs accelerated to a fraction of light speed, hit the lead warship, and punched through its shields as if they did not exist. Drael'Kor shields were designed to absorb and disperse energy-based weapons, and they were among the most advanced in the galaxy. but they had no answer for a simple piece of metal moving fast enough to crack a planet's crust. The slugs tore through the warship's hull from bow to stern, and it broke apart in a shower of fire and spinning metal, dead before its crew even understood what had hit them. The second warship tried to maneuver, but was swarmed by missiles, dozens of them, small and fast, each one carrying an autonomous targeting system that adjusted course in real time, weaving through defensive fire with an almost playful intelligence. They struck in a coordinated pattern that collapsed the ship's structural supports and folded it in on itself like a crushed can. The third warship managed to close to point-blank range, thinking that proximity would neutralize the missile threat. And that was when the Schalenvrin revealed the hybrid weapons, plasma-wrapped tungsten penetrators that hit with the force of a kinetic round and burned with the heat of a star. At close range, they were not weapons so much as acts of destruction given physical form, and the third warship died in a blinding flash that lit up the entire system. The fourth warship turned to retreat and was caught by the electronic warfare suite. Its communications dissolved into static. Its navigation systems began feeding false data, and its targeting computers locked onto its own engines and fired. The ship tore itself apart from the inside out, killed by its own weapons turned against it by human-designed software that had been written by people who spent their careers figuring out how to make technology betray its owners. 4 warships destroyed in under 6 minutes. The refugee fleet in orbit around the planet watched in stunned, disbelieving silence. These were people who had accepted death, who had stopped hoping, who had been waiting for the end with the quiet resignation of species that had learned the hard way that no one was coming to save them. And then someone had come. On the bridge of the Schalenvrin, Vietha stood at the center of controlled chaos, her crew calling out targets and damage reports. Sergeant Reyes coordinating the tactical response from a station the humans had built specifically for him. The ship's systems humming with a power that felt alive and angry and hungry. She was afraid, and she was exhilarated, and she was something she had never been before in her life. She was dangerous. Kreth Damovan watched the destruction of his vanguard from the command deck of the Teeth of Night, and felt something he had not felt in 300 years. It took him a moment to identify it, because it was so unfamiliar, and when he did, it disturbed him more than the loss of 4 warships. It was uncertainty. He ordered the full fleet to engage, all 14 remaining ships turning away from the planet to face this single impossible enemy. And the battle that followed was the most violent and chaotic engagement in Draelcorps military history. The Schalenvrin fought like nothing any of them had ever seen. It did not follow any known tactical doctrine, did not honor any established rules of engagement, did not fight with the predictable patterns that made space combat a science of calculated geometry. Instead, it fought the way humans fought, with aggression and deception and a creative brutality that turned every assumption into a trap. It used asteroid fields for cover. It played dead to draw ships close before unleashing full broadsides. It jammed communications so that Draelcorps ships could not coordinate. It fired missiles from impossible angles using pre-positioned deployments that the crew had launched earlier without anyone noticing. And at one point, it deliberately rammed a Draelcorps cruiser with its reinforced bow, and survived while the cruiser did not. By the time the engagement ended, 8 more Draelcorps ships were destroyed or crippled, and the Teeth of Night itself had taken damage that would have been fatal to any vessel without a warlord's personal shield generator. Kreth stood in the wreckage of his command deck and opened a communication channel to the Schalenvrin. His voice was steady, because he was Draelcorps, and he would not show weakness. But his red eyes burned with something new. "What species built those weapons?" he demanded. "No Rithani designed what I have seen today. Who are your allies?" Vietha's face appeared on his screen, and she looked different from every Rithani he had ever seen. She did not cower, she did not plead, she did not beg. She looked at him with steady silver eyes, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of a dead world and the fire of a living one. "They call themselves humans," she said. "They live on a small blue world on the edge of the galaxy, and they were kind to us." She paused and then added words that Sergeant Reyes had taught her. Words that humans said before a fight. Words that were equal parts warning and promise. I would not recommend making them unkind. The channel closed and Kreth ordered a retreat. The first retreat of his career, pulling his surviving ships back into FTL, with the taste of defeat burning in his throat like acid. Behind him, the refugee fleet erupted in transmissions. A dozen species all talking at once, crying and cheering and asking the same questions over and over. Who were these humans? Where was this Earth? And how could they make contact with the species that had just done the impossible? Kreth filed his report to the Dominion High Command that night. It was thorough and precise, and it ended with a single recommendation. There is a new species. They are not yet among the stars. Recommend immediate subjugation before they are. To the High Command reviewed the battle data. Every scan, every recording, every piece of debris analysis, and for the first time, in 12,000 years of unbroken conquest, they did not approve the recommendation. They tabled it. Because they needed to think. And the Draelcore Dominion had never needed to think before. The story of the Shallan Vryn spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. It moved through refugee camps and hidden colonies, through smuggler networks and diplomatic channels, through whispered conversations on occupied worlds and shouted celebrations on free ones. The details grew larger with each telling, but the core remained the same. A broken ship had limped to an unknown world and come back with teeth, and the empire that had never been challenged was licking its wounds in the dark. Within weeks, envoys from 18 different species arrived in the Sol system, their ships appearing one after another at the edge of human sensor range, broadcasting peaceful intentions and a single desperate request: we want to talk. Earth was not ready for this, and it was completely ready for this at the same time. The United Nations moved faster than it had ever moved in its entire history, establishing what they called the Terran Contact Authority, a new organization dedicated to managing humanity's sudden and dramatic entrance onto the galactic stage. It was staffed by diplomats and scientists and military officers from every major nation, and its first act was to welcome the alien envoys to a hastily arranged meeting at a facility in Geneva that had been built in 6 days by construction crews who worked around the clock because they understood that history was not going to wait for them to be comfortable. Colonel Marcus Cole, now General Cole, promoted by 3 separate committees on the same day, stood at the center of it all, with the same calm, steady presence he had shown on that first night in the Nevada desert. He had become the unofficial face of humanity's contact with the galaxy, not because he sought the role, but because the aliens trusted him. And in this new world, trust was the most valuable currency there was. The envoys brought gifts, and they brought information. They shared star charts and histories and warnings about the Draelcore Dominion. And in return, humanity shared something that stunned them. Not weapons, not technology, but an invitation. Every species that wanted to work with Earth was welcome, and humanity would share what it knew and learn what it did not, because that was how humans had always gotten stronger. Not by hoarding knowledge, but by spreading it. Dr. Lena Okafor was appointed the director of the new Terran Engineering Cooperative, a joint project that brought together human and alien scientists to study and integrate the technologies of a dozen different civilizations. She worked 18-hour days in a facility that grew larger every week, and every morning she woke up with the same thought, that she was living in a future she had dreamed about as a child, and that it was more terrifying and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Humanity began building its own ships. The first human-designed FTL vessel was laid down in a shipyard constructed on the dark side of the moon. Using a combination of Rythani crystal drive technology and human engineering principles that no alien species would have thought to combine. It was not the largest ship, and it was not the fastest, but it was tough and clever and adaptable, and the engineers who built it filled it with the same mixture of deadly seriousness and absurd comfort that had defined the Shaylin Vryn. Railguns and missile bays, alongside a medical ward, a gymnasium, a library, and a kitchen that a French chef had personally designed, because he said that any ship carrying humans into the unknown needed to serve proper food. Volunteers lined up by the hundreds of thousands, not just soldiers, though there were plenty of those, but doctors and engineers and teachers and linguists and artists and musicians and farmers, ordinary people who looked up at the stars and decided they wanted to be part of whatever came next. Sergeant Amir Reyes established the first interspecies combat training academy at Zone Prometheus, now a permanent facility that had grown from a desert camp into a small city. Species from across the galaxy sent their people there to learn the art of human warfare, and Reyes trained them all with the same patient intensity, teaching them not just how to fight, but why, and what it meant to stand between the people you loved and the darkness that wanted to take them. Vietha came home. She returned to Earth as the official Rythani ambassador, the first alien to hold a permanent diplomatic post on a human world, and she arrived to a welcome that overwhelmed her in ways she did not expect. Crowds gathered at the landing site, not to stare at an alien, but to welcome back a friend, and the cheering was so loud she could feel it vibrating in her chest. She traveled to Harlow's Bend, the small Nevada town near the original crash site, because she had heard about something the townspeople had built, and she needed to see it for herself. It stood in the center of the town square, a bronze statue about 3 meters tall, and when Vietha saw it, she stopped walking and could not move. It was a Rythani child and a human paramedic kneeling together in the dust. The moment from that first night, the moment that had cracked something open inside her, rendered in metal and frozen in time. The paramedic's hands were cradling the child's head, and the child's eyes were closed, and there was something in the pose that was so gentle and so real that Vietha felt her vision blur, and she did not try to stop it. She stood there for a long time, and the tears ran down her silver-blue face, and the people of Harlow's Bend stood with her and did not speak, because some moments do not need words. Far away, in the deepest reaches of Draelcor space, Empress Savethra the Undying sat alone in her throne room and studied the intelligence reports that had been arriving in a steady stream since the Battle of Korvan. Savethra was old, older than any living Draelcor, older than most of their recorded history, and she had ruled the Dominion for 4,000 years, with a patience and precision that had made her empire the most powerful force in the galaxy. She had overseen the extermination of hundreds of species, and she had never lost sleep over a single one of them, because she understood the universe as a simple equation. The strong survived, and the weak did not, and sentiment was a luxury that evolution could not afford. The reports on her desk troubled her. Not the weapons. Weapons could always be matched given enough time and resources. Not the shields, or the armor, or the electronic warfare systems that had humiliated Kret's fleet. Those were technical problems, and technical problems had technical solutions. What troubled her was the speed. She read the timeline again and again, looking for an error that was not there. The humans had encountered alien technology for the first time in their history, and had reverse-engineered it, understood it, and improved upon it in a matter of weeks. They had taken 10,000 years of galactic engineering knowledge and treated it not as something to be studied and respected, but as raw material to be torn apart, recombined, and weaponized with an almost casual inventiveness that bordered on the obscene. They did not copy. They improved. They did not adapt. They transformed. They looked at the collected achievements of civilizations that had been sailing between stars since before humans learned to make fire. And their first response was, yes, but what if we made it angry? Sivethra set down the reports and sat in silence for a long time. Then she summoned her war council, 12 of the most powerful military minds in the Dominion, beings who had planned and executed campaigns that had wiped entire species from existence. And she asked them a single question: how long before they build their own fleet? The answer came after 3 days of analysis. At the current rate of human technological absorption and development, they would have a functional battle fleet within 2 to 3 years. Within 5 years, they would have a fleet that could challenge a Drailcore sector command. Within 10 years, they would be a peer military power. And after that, the analysts did not finish the sentence, but they did not need to. Sivethra dismissed the council and sat alone again, and did something she had never done before in 4,000 years of rule. She composed a diplomatic message. It was addressed to Earth, to the species called humanity, and it was carefully worded with a precision that reflected thousands of years of political experience. It was not a threat, and it was not a surrender, and it was not an apology. It was a request for dialogue. The Drailcore Dominion, the empire that had never negotiated, never compromised, never acknowledged that any other species had the right to exist, was asking to talk. When the message arrived at the Terran Contact Authority, General Cole read it in his office, with Vietha standing beside him. He read it twice, and then looked at her, and she looked at Lena, who had come running from the engineering lab when she heard the news. And Lena looked at the shipyard plans on her desk, the blueprints for the second and third and fourth human-built FTL vessels, already under construction on the moon. Cole picked up the phone and said, "Tell the president we have mail, and tell the shipyard to keep building." He hung up and allowed himself a small smile, not triumphant, not smug, but the quiet smile of a man who had done exactly what needed to be done, and was ready for whatever came next. That evening, Vietha stood on the observation deck of Zone Prometheus, now a campus of gleaming buildings and busy launch pads and training grounds where a dozen species learned together, and laughed together, and prepared together for a future that was uncertain, but no longer hopeless. And she looked up at the stars. There was a Rithani proverb her mother had taught her when she was young. When the star falls, it falls forever. She had believed that once. Believed that once something was broken, it stayed broken. That once something fell, it never stopped falling. That the universe was a place of endless descent, and the best you could hope for was to fall gracefully. She did not believe that anymore. She thought of the humans, of Cole and Lena and Reyes and the paramedic and the chef and the furniture designers and the music teacher and the thousands upon thousands of ordinary people who had looked at a ship full of broken strangers and decided without hesitation that the only acceptable response was to help. She thought of how they had caught a falling star, dusted it off, strapped weapons to it, installed a kitchen in it, and thrown it back into the sky with a note painted on the hull that said, "Return to sender." She whispered a new proverb into the night air, one she thought the humans would appreciate, one that she would teach to every Rithani child, so that it would be remembered long after the last star went dark. When the star falls on Earth, it learns to rise with teeth. And far above her, gleaming in the light of 100 billion suns, the first human-built starship cleared the lunar shipyard and turned its bow toward the deep black, ready for whatever was out there. Humanity was coming, and the galaxy would never be the same.